A 21-year-old girl just knelt down on the most famous tennis court on earth and cried so hard she couldn't speak, and somewhere in Southeast Asia, 100 million phones lit up at the exact same second. Before you find out what she did, you need to understand what she was up against. The woman across the net from her wasn't just good. She was the reigning champion of that exact tournament. 12 months earlier, she had won the final without letting her opponent win a single game. 6-love, 6-love. Not a win, a massacre. And now a wild card nobody outside hardcore tennis circles had heard of 2 years ago was standing across from her, in the third round, on center court, with an entire nation's history riding on the outcome. What happens in the next 10 minutes will explain why commentators forgot the words they'd rehearsed, why a legend agreed to share a court with her days later, and why people who study this sport for a living are now using a word you don't expect to hear about someone this young: inevitable. If stories like this are the reason you watch this channel, do one thing before we go further: hit subscribe. Not because a channel needs a number next to its name, but because this is the kind of story that keeps happening in real time, chapter by chapter, and if you're not subscribed, you're going to miss the moment it happens again. Somebody out there is about to become the next person crying on a court nobody expects them to reach, and you deserve to be there when it happens instead of finding out 3 days late in someone else's recap. So subscribe now, while you're thinking about it, because by the end of this video you're going to wish you already had. Now let's go back to where this actually starts, somewhere far smaller than center court. Picture a patched-up court in the Philippines, the kind with faded lines and a net that's seen better years. A young girl is out there hitting balls with her brother and her grandfather. Nobody watching, no cameras, no scouts. Just a family passing a ball back and forth in the heat, the same way thousands of families do every single day, and for most of them, nothing ever comes of it. Except this time, something did. Fast forward past the junior tournaments nobody streamed, past the years of travel and training most people never see, and land yourself in Miami in the spring of 2025. A 19-year-old wildcard, ranked nowhere near the top of the sport, walks out to play a 5-time Grand Slam champion, a woman who had spent years making very good players look ordinary. For a set and a half, the match goes exactly the way everyone expected. Then it stops going that way. The teenager starts finding lines she has no business finding. She starts moving like someone who isn't supposed to be scared, and by the time the last ball lands out, the scoreboard reads 6-2, 7-5, in her favor. Not a moral victory. An actual win, against an actual legend, on an actual big stage. Her name is AlexEala. Say it slowly, because you're going to be hearing it a lot from here. What made people stay wasn't just the scoreline. It was how she talked afterward. She didn't flatten her accent the way so many athletes learn to. She sounded exactly like where she was from, with no apology in it. In a sport that has quietly rewarded players who sound like they could be from anywhere, that refusal to disappear became its own kind of gravity. People weren't just watching the tennis anymore. They were watching her. And if you think that Miami win is where the story peaks, you've barely scratched the surface, because that match wasn't a ceiling, it was a floor. What came after was a slow, relentless climb most casual fans weren't tracking. Win after win, ranking point stacking month after month, until Eala found herself inside the top 30 players on the planet, a number that would have sounded like fiction to anyone who'd seen where she started. And then, like the sport was setting up its own sequel, it handed her a rematch. The same opponent from Miami. Except nothing else about the situation was the same. This was July 2026. This was Wimbledon. This was center court, the most famous patch of grass in tennis. And standing across the net wasn't just a 5-time major champion anymore. She was the defending Wimbledon champion, coming off a final she'd won without dropping a single game. A fortress with a moat around it. And a 21-year-old was being asked to climb it, live, in the third round, in front of the entire tennis world. Here's where you need to lean in, because this is the part that decides everything. The first set alone stretched past 80 minutes. At one point, the champion sat 2 points away from closing the match out completely. 2 points. That's how close this entire story came to never happening the way it did. Eala saved both. Not comfortably, she saved them the way you save something you refuse to let go, clawing her way into a tiebreak that went all the way to 20 points before she finally closed it out by the smallest possible margin that still counts as decisive. Something shifted after that. She broke the champion's serve 5 times across the match, seized total control, and finished the job in straight sets, 7-6, 6-2. 2 hours and 14 minutes of tennis, and when the last point landed, she didn't celebrate like someone who expected it. She fell to her knees in tears. When they finally got a microphone in front of her, she could barely get her sentences out, saying something about how a win like this might look small to a legend with a trophy case already overflowing, but for a kid who trained after school with her brother and grandfather on a court nobody filmed, this was everything. Now here's the sentence that turns this from a great match into actual history. AlexEala had just become the first Filipina ever to reach the second week of a Grand Slam. Not one of the first. The first. 70 years of Philippine tennis history, through players who came close and never broke all the way through, and she walked past every one of them in a single afternoon, on grass, in London, sobbing into a microphone because she couldn't quite process what her own body had just done. If this were a movie, the credits would roll right here. But real stories don't work that way. 2 days later, in the very next round, she ran into a former Wimbledon finalist and lost, 3 tight sets that came down to single points instead of one-sided momentum. The dream run, on paper, was over. And this is exactly where you'd expect the tears to turn into the bad kind, or the excuses to start. Instead, she did something almost unsettling in how composed it was. She talked about fine margins, calmly, like someone twice her age, explaining that at this level, everything comes down to 1 or 2 points, and the only thing you can ever really control is how you respond in that exact instant. No spiral. No excuses. Just a 21-year-old quietly describing the razor's edge between winning and almost winning, as if she'd already made peace with landing on either side of it before she ever stepped on court. That is not the mindset of someone riding a hot streak that's about to run out. That's the mindset of someone planning to be around for a very long time. And if you think the story slows down here, you haven't been paying attention, because what happened next barely had anything to do with singles tennis at all. Weeks before that Wimbledon run, Eala had teamed up in doubles with one of the most decorated players to ever hold a racket, Venus Williams, a 7-time Grand Slam singles champion and 14-time major doubles champion, with a career spanning more than 3 decades. The two had never shared a court before. In their very first tournament together, on grass at Bad Homburg, they reached the quarterfinals. Understand what that means. A player with Venus Williams's resume doesn't need a doubles partner for attention. She has nothing left to prove, and no shortage of other legends who would say yes to her in a heartbeat. So when it was announced, just days after Wimbledon, that the two of them were reuniting, this time on hard court, for the first time on that surface, at the DC Open, that wasn't a scheduling footnote. That was one of the greatest players in the history of the sport looking at every option available to her and choosing, for a second tournament running, a 21-year-old from the Philippines. Williams herself has called Eala her best partner. People who understand this sport read that pairing for exactly what it is, an endorsement with a legendary name attached to it. Now picture the stage this sets up. A hard-court swing stacked with some of the biggest names in the sport, top-ranked opponents, former major champions, the very player who knocked Eala out of Wimbledon, and Venus Williams herself as her doubles partner. Eala walks into it fresh off the best Grand Slam run of her career, fresh off dethroning a defending Wimbledon champion in one of the matches of the year, and fresh off proving her mindset can absorb a gut-punch loss without cracking. But here's what actually makes this bigger than one tournament, bigger than one ranking climb. Ask her what's really driving all of this, and she doesn't talk about points or trophies. She talks about people. In her own words, describing what it feels like to carry an entire community with her, we are a community that uplifts each other, a community that is proud when someone else does well. Nobody handed her that line. That's something she said, trying to explain why this feels different from ordinary fandom, and that single word, community, is doing more work than any statistic could. It explains why watch parties formed across the Philippines for her matches. It explains why her very first instinct after beating a defending champion on the most famous court in tennis was to dedicate the win to an entire country, not as an afterthought, but as the actual point of the run. And it explains something else, something that tells you exactly who you're dealing with underneath the trophies. She said, plainly, that she doesn't want young girls back home growing up wanting to become the next her. She wants them to become the first version of themselves. Sit with that for a second, because that's not humility for the cameras. That's someone who understands, at 21, that the weight she's carrying was never really about her individually. It's about proving a door most people assumed was locked was actually open the whole time. So where does this go from here? That part, nobody can answer yet, not the people who broadcast this sport, not the analysts who track it for a living, not even Eala herself, if her own words are anything to go by. She isn't thinking that far ahead. She's thinking about the next point. But look at what's actually on the calendar. After Washington, the tour rolls straight into more of the biggest hardcourt events of the year, and then directly into the final Grand Slam of the season, the US Open, in a city that happens to be home to one of the largest Filipino communities anywhere outside the Philippines itself. If the pattern holds, if the crowds show up there the way they showed up in Miami, the way they showed up sobbing right alongside her on center court, then the real question stops being whether she's arrived. That question already got answered the moment she beat a defending champion who had just won a Grand Slam final without losing a single game to anyone. The real question now is whether an entire country's tennis history is about to get the kind of sustained global spotlight it has never had in 70 years of trying. Based on everything she's already absorbed under pressure, the impossible saves, the legend beaten twice, the crushing loss handled without a single excuse, the early evidence says she's already ready for it. So here's the honest way to leave this, because the real ending hasn't been written yet, and anyone who tells you they know how it finishes is guessing. Right now, she's a career-high top 30 player standing in the middle of one of the most stacked stretches of hardcourt tennis all year, partnered with a living legend, carrying a nation's attention into every match between here and the last major of the season. Nobody can tell you how far this actually goes. If you've been looking for a sports story that's genuinely being written in real time, one where you can't predict the next chapter no matter how hard you try, this is one of the very few left that fits that description completely, and the next one drops the moment she steps back on court. That's exactly why you don't want to be the person who finds out 3 days late. Hit subscribe now, turn on notifications, and be there when the next chapter actually happens, because it's coming faster than you think, and it will not be scripted. It will be earned, 1 point at a time, exactly the way every single moment of this story has been earned so far.